Today, we're going to talk about responding to hate and bias incidents with students. My name is Matt Kreit. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a teaching and learning specialist here at CTRL. And I'll let my co-facilitator introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shed, like the thing in your backyard. I'm also a teaching and learning specialist at the CTRL, and I go by they or she pronouns. Either is fine.
So getting started, we want to start with just a few guidelines for participation so that you all know how to interact in this meeting and that we can all kind of be on the same page as we start. So what we'll ask you all to do is be present in a way that works for you. You know what you need best, and you can decide how best to participate in the various activities that we have planned today. We'll ask you to ask any of the questions that you have throughout the session in the chat. We'll be able to respond to those easier as well and continue to keep the session moving since we do have limited time today. If you would like to speak or if we ask for verbal responses, feel free to use that raise hand function to speak. That's under your reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. And then finally, be generous with your knowledge and respectful of other folks' knowledge. We also have developed some learning outcomes for this session. There we go. And so by the end of this workshop, we're hoping that you will be able to recognize the value of acknowledging and processing these hate-based events in class with students. You'll be able to develop some strategies to respond appropriately to hate-based events and then plan a response and actually do that planning in the session to process hate-based events with students, considering both the event that occurs and the course that you are teaching. So with that, we want to share with you just a brief session outline so that you kind of know what the plan is for today. So we'll start with some short introductions in breakout rooms, asking you all what brought you to this session today. We'll have a chance for you all to share some of the concerns that you have in responding to these events or acknowledging them within your class. Then we'll talk about the value of responding and the research that we've done on the value of addressing these events in class with your students. And then finally, we'll end with some strategies about how to actually do that acknowledgement and respond to these events in class.
So we're actually going to start with breakout rooms, which we're going to go back to later in the session. And we want to give you all an opportunity to speak with one another and connect over this topic and some concerns we might have about it. So in your breakout rooms, we're going to ask that you each introduce yourselves, your names, your pronouns if you wish to share them, and then your department or program or unit wherever you work at AU. And then after everyone has introduced themselves, please share with one another what brought you to this session, and then what do you hope to gain from attending? And then we're going to ask you to keep that in mind as we move through the content of this session. What questions do we have about the breakout rooms? All right, excellent. Mac, are we ready to go?
Yes, so you're about to just be moved directly into your breakout rooms. So we will see you back in just a few minutes.
To hear from one person, maybe out loud if they'd like to share over video, and then everyone else, please feel free to share in the chat if you would like. But I'd love for someone to raise their hand if they'd like to share what did your group talk about what brought you to the session and what you might hope to gain from attending. Now, William, was that a raising of the hand? Verbally, you were just clearing your throat. Okay, just checking. Oh, Valentina, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, we talked about, well, we introduced each other, and then we talked a lot about the event that happened in Leonard, the sexual assault, since two of us taught a complex problem in UC, and they had their students lived in that dorm. And so we wanted to hear what other people were doing to react to events like that, and something that can go beyond the email that are sent by the university. So how to react in the classroom and how to talk with the student, and yeah, a bit what can be done, but also to hear effectively what other people have been doing.
Absolutely. It's okay if you don't know your group number. I really appreciate that, Valentina, especially because you point out like our students are sometimes directly impacted by the thing. So sometimes we talk about something that happens maybe very far away that our students may not feel a relationship to directly. And then again, we have students who live in the dorms where some of these things happen. Yeah, so that's something that we're going to think about. And we have some great thoughts in the chat too. And so I'm going to just keep us moving because of limited time, but I think Elle has their hand up, so please feel free to share in the chat. But in the meantime, this may have come up in your conversation. We're going to launch a poll here, which is about what concerns you might have when you're bringing these topics to your students. So maybe you do want to talk to your students about one of these incidents, but something might be stopping you, a concern that you have. So I'm going to launch this, and feel free to answer multiple of these if it feels like they apply. You can answer all or one or none or however many. I really like how you put that, Matthew, not scrambling to react. A flexible game plan. I love that. Take a minute to fill that out. Great point, Ximena. Let me know if I said that okay. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share our results because it looked like we stopped voting for the most part. And hopefully you should see the results on your screen now. So it looks like our biggest concern, quite reasonably, is worrying about saying or doing something that makes the situation worse, right? Trying to facilitate a sensitive conversation, but somehow creating more conflict or leaving students feeling maybe like unsure of what you were trying to accomplish. And then in second place, we have that caution about re-traumatizing students, which makes a lot of sense, right? We don't know what students are bringing with them, and we want to be careful not to re-traumatize them. And then behind that, we have feeling unprepared to facilitate. It's great that you're here. That's what we're going to talk about. And I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. Again, we're going to talk about that. And then maybe it doesn't feel related to our course content for all of us. But we're also going to think about that today. Mac, is there anything that you would add here?
I don't think so. I think if there are just any concerns that folks that we didn't capture through this poll and you'd like to share those, you can feel free to do so in the chat and we can respond to those there as well.
So thank you for sharing those. And I'm going to stop sharing. And we're going to move on to thinking about whether or not to respond. And I'll pass it over to Mac for this part.
So as many of you all noted in our poll about the concerns, there are, like a variety of reasons why instructors may not feel particularly equipped to respond or maybe confused about their role in responding to these hate-based events or any of these current events that might occur in class. And just noting that when we're talking about hate-based events, what we're talking about are events such as the sexual assault in Leonard Hall, the invasion of Ukraine, the Colorado Springs shooting that occurred last semester, things like that. So not necessarily the statements that students may make in class that may cause an uncomfortable reaction. However, some of the tools that we will give you will be able to address some of those things that students may say in class. So with that being said, we're thinking about, should you respond to these types of events? And when you do, how do you do it in a way that is both effective and useful for students? So unfortunately, there really still is very little research and support for instructors. So hopefully this session will be helpful for you all. And we know, and the research that it is out there does show that many instructors do feel a pretty strong urge to respond and do something to support your students. It's very clear that instructors care about our students and we care about their mental health and well-being. So we here at CTRL are happy and excited to help you support them. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the research that's out there on responding to these traumatic events in class. You can go to the next slide. So we'll start by kind of pulling back a little bit and highlighting the impact of trauma on the learning process. So essentially what the research tells us is that traumatic events greatly decrease people's ability to learn. This likely makes intuitive sense when you have a big thing going on in your life, whether that's trauma or even something else. It's hard to focus on your studies. And you may find that it's even, tenfold with trauma, since it has such a big impact on people's mental well-being, their ability to just remember and think about stuff. So you may see that after a traumatic event, your students may experience a lack of focus or ability to retain information. So as we're thinking about how to respond, we should keep this in mind, just in general, that when traumatic events occurred, learning is negatively impacted, even if that event or the trauma isn't directly affecting a specific student. So the good news is that you as instructors can have a really big impact on your students' ability to learn and manage trauma by your response to various events that may occur. Luckily, the research shows us that instructors who are perceived as more emotionally supportive can increase students' ability to learn in class and their motivation to do so. So therefore, emotional support and student well-being and student learning really do go hand in hand. So it tells you that it's valuable and useful to respond to these types of events in class. So knowing that, how do we actually go about doing these responses? So what, thanks, Jen. So what you may be pleased to know is that the research shows us that any response is better than no response. So what I'm going to do now is share some research from an article that looked into instructors' responses after the 9/11 attacks. Obviously, this was a national event that impacted essentially everyone in America. So what these researchers did was poll both instructors about their response as well as students about the effectiveness of that response. And what they found is that roughly 60% had some response in class, which isn't a large amount when you consider the national scope of an event like the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And instructors in smaller classes were more likely to respond than those in larger classes. And what is good for you all is that students generally found any response helpful. So this included things like just taking a moment of silence in class. So very small, pretty easy thing to do, all the way up to developing a class project based on the event. So some folks were talking about making quilts or developing a research project based on the event. So luckily, students did find both types of responses helpful and useful to their own learning and their own experience kind of managing and working through the this like national trauma. Students did convey frustration, disappointment, and or apathy when their instructors didn't respond. So some students felt very frustrated and disappointed with their instructors. So I have a few quotes to read. So one that came shed previously, please. So one of the things that, no worries. So one thing that a few of the students said in response to the survey is that, so quote, the instructor didn't mention the tragedy at all and surprisingly didn't give a historical or informational perspective, something I was hoping that my history teacher would explain. So this was an undergraduate in a history course talking about the fact that their history teacher didn't even mention the 9/11 tragedy. Another quote is, my professor was a complete expletive about the whole situation. Not only did he fail to do anything positively related to the attack, he made us come in on a Saturday morning to make up the class period that we missed due to classes being canceled on September 11th. So these are highlighting that these students really wanted some sort of response from their instructors. They wanted some ability to talk about this with their peers and with, in a learning environment. So what this tells us is that some type of response is necessary, but what should that response really look like? Next slide, please. And so I'll highlight here 2 instructor responses that the article highlighted as either being particularly unhelpful on the left or particularly helpful on the right. So that response that was ranked as least effective by the students was just acknowledging that the attacks had occurred and said that the class needs to go on with no mention of opportunities for review, extra help, extra support, really anything like that. So students, it was basically seen as saying, okay, this happened, it doesn't affect us, let's go on with the class period. So that was seen as particularly unhelpful by students. A response that was particularly helpful was when instructors mentioned ways that people could help. So they gave out numbers for various charities, talked about donating blood, shared resources on volunteering. So when you mention these things that students can do, it can help reduce some of that feeling of helplessness and that feeling of just, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. So mentioning these support services or ways that students or anyone could help was ranked as highly effective and highly useful by our students. I'll also note here that we do have a hidden slide. So when we share our slides with you, it'll have all of the responses that were collated, and we'll also talk a little bit about all of those responses again once we get to our final section on strategies to use. So we'll also talk, or lastly, I wanted to note that responding to these hate-based and or traumatic events can build community within your classrooms, even if it does feel uncomfortable. So these, the research does indicate that students greatly appreciate both these shorter and longer acknowledgements and activities, and we'll talk about what some of those can look like in the strategy section towards the end of the session today. Any sort of response that you have with respect to a traumatic or hateful event in class can help you build more positive relationships and promote trust in your classroom, because you're showing to students that you're attentive to the world outside of the classroom and the way that it can affect them and their coursework. So lastly, I have just one final piece of slide, and then I'll give you all a chance to kind of reflect on some of the information that we're sharing. So you may also be wondering, so now that we know that it's very useful and valuable to respond to these types of events in class, how do you actually decide which events to respond to? There are lots of things that happen all throughout the semester, all throughout the year, and that are happening all the time. And how do we decide which ones that we want to talk about or acknowledge in class? So you can consider the proximity. So did it occur on campus, in DC, or in a space where students might be, where most students would be aware of it? Maybe those are events that you'd want to prioritize acknowledging. The magnitude of the event. Is it a worldwide event? Like, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that happened last February. This was a huge event that affected a lot of folks. So these bigger events may be more necessary to respond to. However, I want to note that that doesn't necessarily mean that in a relatively small event shouldn't be acknowledged if it is, close in proximity to students or may have a direct impact on our students. Some other things to keep in mind are, would your students maybe identify with victims? For example, did the event that occurred happen on a college campus, like when the murders of the Idaho students last semester? So your students may be worried, they may be thinking about that, and they may need a little bit of support as a result of thinking that maybe that could happen to them. And then finally, disciplinary context is another thing to consider. So is this an event that's related to your course content? So in that event, it could potentially be useful to discuss that event through a disciplinary lens. And if you don't, that could actually erode trust in the instructor, because maybe it seems like they're not paying attention to what's going on in the world or what's going on in the field. So with that, we've given you a lot of information about the value of responding and why you might want to respond in class. So what we're going to ask you to do is just a short free write reflection to think about some of these questions and think about why you personally might want to address these issues with your students. what are the benefits of responding to hate-based events within your own classroom? So think about that specifically in the context of you, your students, and your discipline. And then if you still have some concerns regarding responding to these hate-based events, you could also consider writing about that. So I will give you all about 2 or 3 minutes to start kind of just thinking about this, writing a little bit. You can write on paper, through voice notes on your phone, through typing, whatever works best for you. And feel free to turn your cameras off. I know it can be a little weird to be writing while people are looking at you. So take another 30 seconds or so to kind of finish up your thought, finish up that sentence that you're writing, and then we'll ask for maybe one person to share verbally or a few folks to share in the chat kind of what they thought about or what they were writing about during this reflection time. Right. Is anybody feeling up or ready to speak verbally? If you'd like to, please feel free to raise that hand, or we're totally okay if folks are not feeling like talking and want to share in the chat. Yeah, Barbara.
Hi. So I was thinking of the town in Minnesota that when there were anti-Semitic incidents against Jewish families in the town, that everybody put menorahs in their windows as an act of solidarity. And I always try and bring those kinds of stories to class, to my students, so they can realize that there's a lot more peace building going on than maybe we read about in the press. I was thinking about Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and what he always told little kids that were hurting. He said, find the helpers, find the healers and the helpers. And I saw that when I went to Ukraine last year, that in the midst of war, people were trying to bring light and love and help. So I thought of Mr. Rogers and all the episodes I've seen where communities have pulled together to express solidarity for those who have been targeted.
Thanks for sharing that, Barbara. I think that's really powerful, and highlighting to students not only that these things are happening, but that maybe it's not I don't want to say it's not the end of the world, but it can be a space where you can highlight some of the positives or some of the positives related to community building. So thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, Kimberly. You're still on mute if you're speaking.
Sorry, I always do that. Community building is of the utmost concern, especially in my Writing 101 class, because I typically talk about the rhetoric of the civil rights movement. And I remember last semester, there was a young student in the class, and her one parent was Russian, one parent was Ukrainian. And, I just let her, I came into class and I just said, okay, let's talk. Let's just talk. And she, everybody expressed, some type of, fear, some type of, discomfort and everything. And, she really did and gave the reasons why. But, I think we concentrate, and we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't, we concentrate mostly on what students feel. But in that moment, I was concentrating also on what I was feeling as their instructor, and that shared experience that all of us were feeling, we were able to express, and there's a catharsis, I think, in that. And I think I would like to know of more strategies that instructors can, implement for their own self-care when, these sorts of, incidents occur. So.
Absolutely. Thanks for that reflection, Kimberly. I think so right now in our session today, we really did focus on the students, but we can definitely follow up with some resources for instructors. I know we have a lot. I did a session on mental health last semester, and we have a lot about instructors' mental health as well. And Bruce, we are a little bit over time right now. So if you could just type that reflection or that question in the chat, we'd be happy to answer it there. And I'll pass it over to Shed to get to your point, Kimberly, about strategies for students.
Absolutely. And also, I'm really happy to share some strategies at the end of the session about instructor well-being too, because I agree it's so important. So let's get to those strategies that we were talking about. So I want to point out quickly that everything we're going to talk about is going to align with trauma-informed teaching. If you haven't heard of that before, it's actually inherited from medical models of trauma-informed care. And I've linked here an article that I really love on trauma-informed teaching. And so when you download the slides, which we're going to share with you, feel free to read that. There are at least 5 principles, depending on what you're reading, of trauma-informed teaching, but they tend to boil down to these 5 that are in that article. Establishing safety in learning spaces, understanding and acknowledging trauma, offering options and flexibility, encouraging collaboration and reflection, and helping students imagine the future. If this is something you want to learn about more, we have some great resources around the topic, including online ones and a workshop. And so we're really happy to share more. But the main idea here is that we are going to, everything we mentioned today is going to align with trauma-informed strategies having to do with safety or a feeling of safety, validating trauma, being flexible, encouraging collaboration, etc. I put an asterisk next to safety to remind us to consider what we mean by when we use terms like safe or brave spaces. There's a lot of conflict in educational conversation about what these terms mean and whether they're appropriate and equitable. At the end of the day, I would feel free to use the term for your course that is going to work for you, safe, brave, or something else entirely. I would just keep in mind, it really comes down to your practices. So we might say our class is safe or brave or 3rd term, 4th term, but what's important is that we are flexible, we encourage reflection and collaboration, we create a transparent space where students know what's expected of them, where we give students options. The sort of strategies we're going to bring up, that's what really creates safety, or whatever we might want to call it, more than just the name. So what we're going to do here is look at some activities by the amount of time they take up. This is just one sort of axis to think about it. But if you're thinking about, I want to acknowledge this, but based on those 6 criteria that Max shared earlier, I feel like the magnitude, proximity, identification, I feel like maybe we're going to spend less time on it. Or maybe you feel like your students are just really caught up, right? They cannot move on until they acknowledge this issue in some way. You might spend a whole class session on it. So over on the side of a minute or two, we have strategies, and these are all strategies from the article on addressing 9/11 that Mac brought up earlier, which is linked in the PowerPoint. You could do a minute of silence. Students have found that helpful. Mentioning resources like counseling services, offering to speak privately with students. And then of course, like Mac had mentioned earlier, dealing with those feelings of helplessness by mentioning to students how they can help. And you could even point out some of the strategies that you use. You might even say, when I have these feelings of helplessness, which I do right now, which might feel kind of validating for them, what I like to do is research resources or donate to charity or volunteer in my area, something like that. In the middle, you could read a passage from an inspirational book, ask students if they were personally affected. You could have a brief discussion, and we'll talk more about what that could look like in a moment. And then all the way on to something that's a bigger project or a whole class session. You could decide to do a project as a class, like a quilt, a painting, create a resource for the community that can really help with those feelings of helplessness. You could incorporate that event into your lesson plan. If you are teaching, right, that quote that Max shared from the student who had a history teacher, what a great opportunity, right, to talk to students using a historical frame. Students can practice the disciplinary skills that they've been working on, right, if it feels appropriate, right? Maybe they feel too overwhelmed to talk about it, but that's the kind of thing you talk to your students about to understand. And you can dedicate that whole class session if it feels appropriate. An additional strategy that does not relate to time necessarily is giving students some extensions for some assignments. For example, right after a tragedy, it might be tough to ask students, still turn things in at the same time. People need time and space to process events. So it's important to be flexible with our students and to give them maybe a little bit of wiggle room or a date range for a submission, understanding that we can't just keep chugging on through traumatic events, right? We're going to need a little space, and that is totally normal and okay. And then back to, right, the topic of the course, right? If it's a history course, it's going to be really important to acknowledge, right? If the issue is related to your course, or as we said, it's important to acknowledge it no matter what, but it can become really, really more crucial if it's related directly to the course content. And then that's a great opportunity actually to create a sort of like informed space for that conversation. This might be the only space your students have to talk about the issue in a critical way. And now here are some activities. If we want to process with our students, these range from, so this is a different axis, so a couple different spectrums for you, or spectra for you today, all the way from anonymous to identifying with commentary. On the anonymous side, you could do, okay, I love this. I'm not going to read all of them, but I just want to acknowledge the write and toss because it's my favorite. You could do this in person, but you could also do a version online. In person, students write down what they're thinking or feeling anonymously. They crumple it up and they throw it into, a big pile. And then I see Barbara shaking, nodding along. And then each grab someone else's paper. It could be yours, but no one would know. And then we read them all aloud. And the idea is you just get all of those ideas and feelings and anxieties out there. And then that can kind of like create a space to really have a deeper conversation. I will keep in mind, right, to use your judgment with, does the class feel a sense of connection? Do you trust that this will be like a safe exercise for anonymity with students? Maybe you could give them some guidelines before they do it and say, hey, please be sensitive. Just keep in mind, everyone has a different experience and we're not trying to, argue about who's right about anything, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of options here. And so please feel free to look this over and ask me questions. I'm really happy to give details and examples for any of these activities. And I also marked debate. A quick reminder here is that debate, just be really careful would be my advice. The saying, when students debate, we want to make sure they're not debating something that's a personal experience for them. Debates can often come down to agreeing on whether people should have certain access or rights, or whether they're a human being. And we don't mean to create that situation, but of course, we don't want to put students in a situation where they're arguing about an experience they had and how they experienced it. So just something to keep in mind, to be really cautious with that. Here is some sample language that we might use when talking with students. Now, we don't want you to go into class and read a script, right, to them. This is more so how you might bring the conversation to students. And so I'm going to go ahead and, for accessibility, read the first one and let you just think about, what are the components in there that we suggest that you mirror. So this would be a minute of silence after the Colorado spring shooting. We want to acknowledge the hateful shooting that occurred over the weekend at the Queer Club in Colorado and the impact that had on the victims and broader queer community. We know that a simple acknowledgement is not adequate and does not solve or address all of the issues at play, but it is what we can offer to you in this space today. We'll give people a few moments of silence, so please feel free to turn off your camera. This would be if you're online, and use this time in a way that works for you. If you need more support or would like to talk more, please reach out to us. So this strategy, right, this sort of intro, it's only for a minute of silence, right? But it does a couple really great things: acknowledging the issue, right? Opening yourself up for communication and resources, acknowledging how students might feel, overwhelmed. This might not be enough for them. We can't solve the problem, but let's just take some space. I will say here, this really depends on your experience and relationship to the issue, how you word it. So I might use a word like queer because I identify as queer. Maybe for you, you might say, I don't have a relationship to this issue, but I care about it, right? Or I know that it might impact you or some people right? So really depending on the situation, you want to put it in your words. And then we have the second one. Let me get your thoughts, Max. Should I read that second one or let you all kind of look at it on your own?
I think for accessibility, reading is probably best.
Excellent. All right, let me read this one of a framing of a conversation after the Halloween sexual assault that happened on campus. As you may have heard yesterday, a horrific sexual assault was reported on campus. I know that I'm working through many emotions surrounding what happened, and I'm guessing that many of you are as well. I'd like to take some time in class today to process what happened as a group. You're certainly not required to participate in this conversation, and I trust that you know what you need at this moment. You're welcome to join in and share your thoughts or step out if you need to. If you need extra time in the assignment due this week, you all have an automatic extension until Monday morning. If you need further extensions or support, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to help. So again, some of those same strategies coming in there. Acknowledging what happened. I like that the instructor in this example acknowledges their own sort of processing of the event. That's very humanizing, right? Letting students know they're not the only ones dealing with it. And then saying, let's take some time and giving students that flexibility. Remember, trauma-informed teaching has to do with flexibility and options for students. So we're not going to force them to participate, but we invite them and say, do what's going to work for you in this moment. And to give those students the options, maybe you step out, maybe you, turn off your camera, like in the first example. Maybe you are just silent today. Maybe you write down what you're thinking and keep that. And then as well, the extension for the due date. So giving people maybe a date range. You could still turn in the assignment if you're ready and if you find that working is helpful for you in this moment, but there's also an extension and the invitation to ask for a little more time and space if they need it. And then finally at the bottom here, here are some options that you can give students. If you say, I want us to take time to process this, which of these do we want to try? Could we do a discussion? Would you all prefer to reflect and write on your own and just sort of keep that to yourselves? Would you like to do a think, pair, share, or would you like to just move on with the class? And sometimes students might say, I want to move on, or maybe you'll get conflicting answers, and then you can work with students to say, okay, how can we make some space for this? Okay, if some people would like to reflect independently, I'm going to make a space for that. And I'm also going to make space for anyone who might like to do a sort of think, pair, share, right? It's not going to be perfect, but it's more so, that acknowledgement is really important for students, as Mac pointed out earlier. And so here's a sort of framing device I want to suggest to you all. When we approach these discussions, students might come to them thinking that there is a secret right answer. There's a secret way to get an A on this impromptu conversation. I just have to figure out what the teacher wants. And if I do it, I get a check mark for the day. We want to discourage that frame of mind, especially because it drives students to just sort of like contribute and then like totally withdraw, right? Not really engage. So what we do instead is we emphasize not a right or wrong answer, but curiosity, exploration, listening, reflection, dialogue, understanding, and respect, rather than agreement or expertise. Not that you as the instructor can't be an expert, but rather that we don't want, to crown a winner in the class who is right about the issue. We want to encourage understanding more than resolution. So it's not that students need to leave the class all agreeing on what's right or wrong, but rather they understand why someone feels this way and why someone feels that way. And these are all disciplinary skills. Every discipline values these skills: curiosity, exploration, listening, etc. Right? So you can tie it back to the course and whatever you're teaching, or the major, the department, the program. Of course, always be transparent about the goals of the discussion. Students might think, right, again, there's some hidden goal, there's some secret thing I'm supposed to be able to do, and just outright saying, contribute in the way that works for you. There is no right answer. I'm hoping you might raise your hand and speak, but if you don't, you will still be participating by, following along the conversation or writing independently in a reflection. Lower the stakes by showing students what a contribution looks like and what the options are for contribution. Consider generating community guidelines. If you haven't done this before, I recommend giving it a try. So when you talk with students saying, okay, how are we going to work together right now? Let's come up with a couple rules for how we're going to treat one another, and let's agree to work with them. So we're going to be compassionate. We're going to disagree with opinions and not insult one another directly, right? We're going to do X, Y, Z. And then if things get weird, which they always will eventually, how will we deal with it compassionately? We're not going to shout. We're going to explain our feelings using like I statements, right? From psychology. So of course, that's how I see everything. And then my final point, avoid talking around the issue, right? So instead of saying something happened and we're all dealing with it, right? That can feel kind of unnerving, like it's taboo, like we're not allowed to say it. So you might even practice with yourself saying, there was a hate-based incident. There was a sexual assault, right? There was a shooting, not to get into graphic detail with students, but rather to name it and say racism, right? Sexism, whatever it might be, or more than one of those at once, most likely, to address it so students know, right, their experiences can be talked about. And again, these all align, these are all trauma-informed principles that we've talked about, which I'm happy to talk about more if people are interested. My last little note here before we move on to our next activity is to remember two things, or one big thing and then two subpoints. You don't need to be an expert. And I know that could be an anxiety for us. That came up in our poll earlier, but I'm not an expert, right? Maybe you say, I'm not an expert on school shootings, on sexism, on racism, right? If that isn't true for you, then how will I guide students on this conversation? And it's good that we're cautious in that way, right? We don't want to overstep, but I want to remind you that you can still facilitate a conversation without being an expert on every facet of what happened. One strategy that we can use is honoring lived experience. So when we're talking to students, maybe if someone says something that we feel might be transphobic, but maybe we don't identify that way. So I personally don't identify as trans, but maybe a student says something and I want to contest it because I feel like it's insensitive to trans folks. I might say, you know, if we listen to what our trans community members tell us, we know that is hurtful. We know that language is not acceptable. So honoring what we know from the marginalized groups that are affected by these experiences, even if we don't share that, we honor it. The other strategy we can use here is relying on empathy. So maybe I don't know what it's like to experience, let's say, racism. So I'm white passing. I don't deal with racism in the same way that, for example, my brother does, who appears Arab, right? So I might say, I don't know what that's like, right? But I imagine if I was in that position, or if I listened to what that person has told me, that is really challenging. That behavior is not acceptable, XYZ. So if I was in that position, I think I would be really hurt by that. I think I would find that dehumanizing, right? Or I know that that group finds that dehumanizing. So well, quickly, let me ask, Mac, anything that you want to add? All right, excellent. So let's move on over here to our small group discussion. And I think I'm actually passing it back to you, Mac. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
So yeah, so you all have gotten a lot of information, a lot of strategies, and a lot of just maybe ideas to think about. So what we'd like you all to do is in small groups, so these will be your same small groups as previously, discuss some of these questions. We want to make sure that this is an open discussion, so you're welcome to consider these questions that we've developed, but you can also really talk about anything that's sticking out to you. So I'll go ahead and copy those questions into the chat, which I apologize for not doing earlier for your first breakout rooms. But here you have these questions as you go into these breakout rooms again. And then when we come back, we will ask for a few folks just to share some of their thoughts that they talked about in the class, in the breakout rooms. Do you have any questions before we send you all into the rooms? All right, Shed, are they ready? Perfect.
I accidentally kicked myself out of my room. Okay.
You're not giving.
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah.
You're not giving us
I just know I have to apologize to the person who I interrupted in the middle of their sentence.
We need more time in those small groups.
I know, I wish we could have a 2-hour-long session and give everybody a chance to talk for so long.
We're just glad y'all are talking.
Yeah, we're very glad that you all seem to have a very useful and productive conversations. So we'll invite anybody who's interested in sharing, either to share verbally by raising your hand, or in the chat if you want to share some stuff that your group's talked about.
I can share for our group. So we talked about the different options that we have. And I think the thing that I come away with after those conversations is what works for one student and one person will not work for the next. So we do have to give our students and ourselves space and flexibility to engage in different ways. So I think especially if you are going to engage with the material in class, giving your students a heads up before makes sense. I offer the example that after sexual assault this semester, I sent my students a poll, like, how do we want to deal with class tomorrow? Because it seems wild that we would have a normal class. I'm not going to do that. But what would make sense? So we gave students different options and they chose, and majority of students chose similar things, but it was also eye-opening to think like what they perceived would be supportive at that time. So.
That's a great point. Or go ahead, Chad.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a great point, Amanda, and offering, like you said, not everyone needs the same thing in the same space, and offering that choice is so useful and important when responding to events like this. Shed, were you going to say something?
No, you captured it. Go ahead, Brian.
So one thing that came up for the two of us who were in our discussion group was both of us are teaching graduate courses. And so the events on campus have a very different meaning for grad students who don't live on campus, come to campus solely to take their courses and possibly use the library. And I would like to have some sort of some suggestions as to what to do in that context, because I can tell you that for me last term, there didn't seem to be much by way of desire on the part of the students to try to deal with any of the events that may have happened on campus.
So maybe it feels like students are not always open to the conversation. Is that what it feels like?
No, it feels like that they feel disconnected from it, as if they
Oh,
were
I see.
looking at it from the outside, if they were living in the Washington, D.C. area and reading about it in the paper or watching it on TV news.
Right.
Gotcha. And so maybe in those situations, these smaller acknowledgements may be the best to use. So if it feels disconnected and like it's not something that folks want to do, just acknowledging that it happened, saying, you know, this happened, I'm here to support you. If you'd like to have conversations, we can. But if we want to move on with class, that's okay too. I know when I was a graduate student, I felt pretty connected to the community. So that might also be dependent on individual students, on how much they actually engage with the community, you know, what type of graduate program they're in. If they're in a master's program versus a PhD, they may have different experiences due to just the amount of time that they're here on campus. So, you know, there are ways that you can still acknowledge and recognize that things happen, even if you don't have that longer conversation about it. Shed, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. I think you captured it. Well, one thing I would add is, you know, you can post some resources on Canvas, you know, and say like, if you need it, that's there, you know, and maybe later they'll get into it. But I like that, Mag. Yeah, sometimes a minute is really all that it feels right for that class. Yeah. I'm going to move us on to our final reflection here. And I think I'm going to give this over to you, Mac, if that sounds right. Or I think maybe it's both of us. In which
I
case,
think
I'll
you can go ahead, Shed.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's a strategy that you'd like to learn more about or that sticks out to you? So it's hard to predict, right? Like where we're gonna go, what's gonna happen. We can make a really beautiful plan, but then maybe, the world happens and we need to change it. So instead, we'd like you to just explore different strategies, get to know them, so you have some in your toolkit for when the moment comes. So feel free to let us know in the chat what's one you want to learn more about, and feel free to ask your questions too. We're really happy to answer them. I love the idea of the poll too, especially the anonymity it offers, like before class, especially that lets you know maybe a student is like, this might be triggering for me. This is not right. That might not be the space for me, which is really good to know.
I also just want to highlight what Barbara said about the power imbalance.
Yeah.
So Barbara talked about the power imbalance that students may feel, that faculty versus staff might have more information than them. So being honest about the information that you have and that you're not hiding anything and that you're kind of in the same space as them is very important. So I wanted to highlight that because I really appreciate that comment, Barbara.
And I really appreciate Matthew's point here about revisiting class agreements, because we do a lot of stuff early in the semester and then it all kind of flies out of their heads, right? Like students have a lot of stuff going on and we have a lot of stuff going on. So, why not remind students through the semester of your class agreements you might have, and sometimes of like the goals and your expectations, just to help them out. I think it's a great idea. I'd love to see in the chat more strategies that we're thinking about or that we have questions about, and which current or future educators can go to continue such. That's a really good question. And let me know, Jep, let me know if I said that okay. I I think so. One place is we do talk about the pedagogical side of this at the CTRL a lot in our workshops and with our online resources. But in general, I'm curious to know, I am not as familiar with the AU campus. Actually, Mac and I are both relatively new. What are some resources you all suggest on campus for those sort of conversations? More strategies to de-escalate. Yeah, we could talk about that. Just check over this.
We actually do have Shed and I ran a presentation a few months ago about how to have kind of difficult conversations in class that may have some guidelines that would be useful to folks. And we can go through that and pull out that relevant information and share it in a follow-up email.
Do we have a moment for me to answer some of these questions, Mac, or we're right at time, right?
I think I am okay to hang out. I don't know what your schedule looks like. And I know that AFC, there are lots of sessions, so folks can feel free to leave as they need. But I'm happy to hang around and continue talking to folks, at least for maybe like 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes.
Same. I've got another session in 10 minutes, but I'm going to quickly address the questions that I feel like I'm culpable for because I introduced, something I don't want Mac to have to answer for my thoughts. So strategies on de-escalating, just some stuff that comes to mind for me. I would say if things feel like they're really escalating, taking a moment, like literally pausing the class, asking students to take a deep breath, asking them to take a moment and reflect, maybe write down what they're thinking, and just for themselves, so like they can kind of gather their thoughts. You can remind students of your classroom agreements that you have, or you can even say, if it feels really intense, let's come back to this later. If it feels like you're going in circles and the conversation's not productive, then you might say, let's come back to this with a break in between, or more information, or more strategies prepared. Mac, what comes to mind for you on de-escalation?
I just put a resource in the chat about what Columbia's Teaching and Learning Center calls hot moments.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Heated, offensive, intense. And it has some just really fantastic information about what these types of events are, how you can avoid them, what you can do during, and then what you can do after if one does occur in your course. So I think that resource is going to be really helpful for folks if you are thinking about this issue of like student discussions in class.
When leading, Laura has a good question about leading a discussion. So when leading, I think maybe it could be helpful to structure around questions and to remind students there is no right answer. So how are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are your worries? And then maybe like, so what can we do, right? Sort of orienting students towards the fact that they do have it's more that you want to learn from them, give them the space to process. So there's not right answers. You orient them towards the fact that they can do something, and that it's okay to feel the way that they're feeling. So that sort of validation and collecting some ideas from them. That's just a couple ideas. And I think maybe being prepared for some things like having them write for a second by themselves to prepare what they might want to share, or saying to them ahead of time, we're going to talk about this. Here's a question I'm going to ask. So just brainstorm how you might answer that. Let me know, Mac, what you would add to that. I feel like that was kind of scant from me.
I think that was really good, Shed. I think the idea of offering folks, even yourself, some time to think before having that discussion can be really useful. And then you can kind of just ask folks what they're what they wrote about. And this could be, anything, right? They could write about anything related to the event. And then that can help you lead and guide the discussion. And I will note that you probably have more skills about leading discussions like this than you might think.
You think, yeah.
Our conversations in class, we respond to what students are saying. We guide the conversation in a different direction if it needs to be guided, and you're able to do that on the fly with your course content, and you can do similar things with discussions like this. It's just less related to that course content, so using those similar strategies just in a different context.
to speak to Brenda's question, not putting students on the spot. I'm really glad that we're thinking about that. One thing to do would be just invite students to share their experiences, without targeting anyone, without saying, why doesn't a Arab member of the class say something? And I'm like, well, I guess that's me, right? And everyone's looking at me. But what you could do is have some like lived experience prepared, like a short video or a quote from someone who's had the experience. And that way you can kind of refer to, what someone said. So, that it doesn't have to be a voice in the classroom necessarily. You could also have them like maybe write about their personal experience privately. And maybe then they might feel a little more prepared to share it if they have it sort of practiced. But again, right, we don't want to require anyone. And of course, sharing your like you first is kind of right. Students are often like, this is a trap, you go first. So if you share first, that can really help calm them down, right? They're like, oh, it's actually okay to share. Just looking through.
So I think maybe given time, Shed, we should just go ahead and close and let folks move to their next session. And then also give you a little bit of time to prepare for your next session.
Right.
And at any point, if you all need to reach out to us, we have our contact information. You can find it on CTRL's website, and we're happy to continue the conversation and talk to you more about really anything related to your teaching.
And I'll just pop in here quickly to say that if you have a chance before you leave, please take a moment to fill out the brief evaluation survey, the link to which I've just posted in the chat. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Gavin.